Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Jag heter Henrik Möller, musiken är komponerad av Testbild och den fina loggan till podden är skapad av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. I det här avsnittet har vi vår kanske viktigaste gäst någonsin, Jeff Vandermeer. Därför att i ett program om kreativitet är Jeff Vandermeer helt rätt gäst. Jeff är inte bara författare, förnyare av genren weird fiction och har letat som efter nålar i höstackar och avgrundshål efter nya intressanta författare som tar genren till nya oväntade ställen och sammanställt detta i flera samlingsvolymer för oss att avnjuta. Jeff föreläser om kreativitet och kreativt fantasifullt skrivande och han har spenderat en stor del av sin karriär med att forska på just det ämnet. So Jeff, why is creativity important?
I mean, I was just talking about this in this environmental presentation I gave, which is to say that a lot of times when we can't conceive of solutions to problems and difficulties we've gotten ourselves into, and you may hear our cat in the background, it's because of a lack of imagination. And creativity is a way to kind of strengthen the muscle of the imagination. Even if you're not a professional writer or a professional artist, that isn't the career you want, you know, engaging in that sense of play, engaging in imaginative activities like writing, I think, you know, kind of open up your mind and make it easier to imagine solutions in the real world to things. And I really do think, you know, our governor, Rick Scott, has probably never cracked open a book in his life. And he's the most horrible politician you can possibly think of, in part because he has such a tiny imagination. And he just can't conceive of how other people might feel or of solutions to problems that are not other than very basic. So in a real world scenario, you know, creativity has a lot of applications. Even when you talk about environmental fiction writing and things like that, you know, being able to find creative and unusual ways of expressing certain things is, I think, very, very important. But also, I think the human animal really needs to engage in kind of just play for its own sake, and that's what the imagination is, and that's what creativity is.
Så vad jag tolkar Jeffs svar som är att om man skriver fiktion rent allmänt så tränar man sig på att sätta sig in i andra människors situationer och därmed deras tankesätt. Man blir alltså helt enkelt mer empatisk. Men om man däremot även skriver inom fantastic fiction så övar man sitt sätt att tänka utanför lådan, som man säger thinking outside of the box, och bidrar därmed till kreativ problemlösning och improvisation. Anledningen att jag tar upp detta, och nu drar jag iväg en bit här, det är för att påvisa att fantasi i sig kan användas till något värdefullt. Jag under så länge jag kan minnas tyckt mig känna den uppenbara skammen hos författare i Sverige som skriver skräck och fantasy och sci-fi, att de oftast tvångsmässigt måste påpeka att deras verk egentligen bara är allegorier eller i alla fall att de har starka politiska angelägna budskap i botten. Jag har ju sysslat både med politisk film och icke-politisk film och det har kommit ganska naturligt. Och jag tycker att en bra historia ska få vara en bra historia oavsett. Och jag tror att anledningen att de håller på så här, det är för att skräck och fantasy och science fiction anses bara vara trams i Sverige. Men strunt i detta nu och tillbaka till Jeff Vandermeer. Jeff har skrivit icke-fiktion som Why Should I Cut Your Throat, Book Life, Strategies and Survival Tips for the 21st Century Writer, The Steampunk Bible, Monstrous Creations, Explorations of Fantasy through Essays, Articles and Reviews och slutligen nu den viktigaste, Wonderbook, The Illustrated Guide to Creating Imaginative Fiction. Det var den här boken som var kanske den största anledningen till att jag ville intervjua Jeff Vandermeer. Den här boken är den mest bizarra och för den som är intresserad av att skriva fantastisk litteratur en guldgruva. Bokens struktur och utformning är i sig svår att beskriva, så jag lät Jeff själv göra det.
It started out, I was going to pitch a book about Shared Worlds, which is a teen science fiction fantasy writing camp that I help run. And basically the first week they create their own fantasy or science fiction world in groups, and then they write about it individually in the second week. And I thought that would be an interesting thing to pitch to my editor at Abrams, which does coffee table books. They weren't interested in that. They thought it was too specific. And I said, okay, what about a writing book that's mostly visually driven or somewhat visually driven? And it turned out that they'd been wanting to do that for a while. And the most unique thing about the whole project was they then threw a bunch of money at me, and they said, go out, find your own designer, bring it to us more or less camera ready. No publisher ever says, go write it and bring it to us, the design camera ready, which meant that I could actually do the design myself through a designer. I didn't have to rely on the publisher. And that's really the only way the book got done, because you're absolutely right in bringing up the idea of like, how did you know how to structure this? I didn't at first. No one had ever done a book like this before. So there was nothing to mimic. So we spent a lot of time putting text and image together in experimental ways and figuring out what layout worked best. It got so crazy that the first designer actually put the page numbers in a different place on every single page, which was nuts. And the whole thing at one point looked like it was just going to fall apart. And then slowly we found the structure for it. Slowly we realized these things can be visualized. These things still have to be in text. Here's how the text and the image should interact. And so if the publisher hadn't just let me go off and do my own thing, this couldn't have happened, because I would have had to present text to them and my ideas about image to the publisher, and they would have put it into a layout, and it never would have gotten to that point. It would have just fallen apart. So I was very lucky that I had so much time to experiment. But that was the process. It was just trial and error until we got it right. And then once we got the template right, then it was pretty smooth sailing.
So, how did you find the right artist to design the book?
Well, at about the same time that this was about to happen, I'd been looking for another artist, because all the artists I was working with were great, but they had a particular style, and I wanted something that was more of a pop art style. And this guy, Jeremy Zerfas, who did the cover of Wonder Book and so many pieces inside, just happened to send me his portfolio a few days before I was going to have to start up on this project, more or less. And we just clicked. The thing that was great is that he was good about taking my rough sketches and turning them into something useful. He had the right style. He was very influenced by manga and anime as well as other stuff. And so he had a visual style that was very open and kind of approachable for a modern audience. And so we just clicked on that. And then I had to have someone else come in and do layout, because Jeremy wasn't really used to doing layout. He was just used to doing the art. And then I looked at writers that I really admired, like Neil Gaiman and Nnedi Okorafor and others, and had them do sidebar articles and different pieces to kind of supplement my own ideas about writing. I wanted it very much to be a book where you could find different points of view. So sometimes the other people who are included in the book contradict something I say about writing, which is perfectly fine, because there's no one answer to any of these questions. But that's basically how it came about. And trial and error on the images. There were some images that I tried that it was just quite clear that ultimately I was trying to force something visually, and it just had to be said in a paragraph instead of in an image.
I've studied a lot of structure and storytelling for many years, but I've heard that some people who are just getting into this stuff find this book overwhelming in its assault visually and structurally. Do you have any advice how to use it in a simple way?
Well, I mean, the way that the text and the images interact, you can just read the text and ignore the images entirely, and it's coherent. I mean, so there's different threads. The idea is it's just like sometimes certain websites you go to where there's 3 or 4 different things going on, sidebars to look at, links and whatnot. But you don't have to. What I suggest for people who feel overwhelmed or aren't used to a visual style is either just look at the major diagrams and kind of let them sink in, or just read the text. And also don't worry about reading it in order necessarily. I mean, if you have an issue with like structure or plot, just go to that section. Just look at the diagrams first, or look at the text. But the way that it works, everything is more or less self-contained. There are some things that do obviously talk to one another between the text and the image, but you're under no obligation to take it all in at once.
How would you describe the book to someone listening to this pod who have never heard of it before?
It's the only creative writing book that I'm aware of that is highly visual in nature and replaces text with image to teach, and also is fairly balanced between saying that there are certain things that are organic about writing and subconscious, and there are certain things that are mechanical, and that if you can learn the difference between the two, you can improve your writing immeasurably just by going with the flow when you need to, and then also learning how to edit your work. That's kind of the pitch. I mean, you can look online and type in Wonderbook Jeff Vandermeer and you'll find tons of information about it.
I know a lot of people who have been very creative early on in their lives and then just suddenly lost it. Do you know why that is, and do you think they can do anything about it?
I mean, some of it is very early on. I think I say in Wonderbook that there's a great example in a writing book by Carol Bly called The Passionate Accurate Story, where she gives the example of the difference between a child who comes back from playing to dinner, family dinner, and the father asks, who moved in next door? Who are the new neighbors? And the child says, oh, it's a family of bears. Well, whether the father decides to, play along with that and say, oh, a family of bears, can you tell me more about them? Or says, don't be ridiculous, it's not a family of bears who moved in, it makes a huge difference in how that child growing up perceives the value of the imagination. And the same thing happens in school. If you have English teachers who assign you writing short stories, but then they grade it based on the grammar alone, they're telling you they value the grammar, they don't value the imagination. And so all of those things in society can come into play to kind of make you feel like this is not something that's important to do. It's not important to read books. It's not important to engage in imaginative play. And so by the time you reach your 20s, you may have been taught that lesson in a lot of different ways. I think also the business world does that by saying that, you need to be efficient, you need to be practical and things like that. When in fact some of the best businesses and companies get to the point where they're great because of imagination and play.
How did you start out getting into fantastic fiction?
My parents read things like William Blake's poetry to me when I was a kid, and they were very good about reading me stuff and giving me stuff before I was really ready for it, which is actually really good. Like Lord of the Rings I got when I was like 9, and so when you read Lord of the Rings when you're 9, you don't really understand it, parts of it, because you don't understand every word in it. And it's kind of a weird feeling, but it's kind of a good feeling. And you were talking about like how'd you get into creativity and talking about that, like things like Wonderbook. The same thing applies to writing books. I always like writing books where they're kind of a level beyond me, and there's things in there that I get and things I don't get. So when I put together stuff like Wonderbook, I think about that, and I think about the layering of experience and experience levels. Because I think there's something mysterious about reading a text where you get most of it, but you don't get all of it the first time around, and you have to go back to it to find something else in it, which is also a good description of what really good fiction is like. Even when you understand it all, hopefully you go back to it and you find something different in it the second time. So
when did you start to write?
I started by writing kind of a personal diary that then became more or less retellings of Aesop's fables and things like that. So I was writing when I was about 8 or 9, and I started out in poetry and kind of writing stuff that was kind of more mainstream lit, edited poetry magazines. And then when I started writing fiction, it just started kind of naturally coming out, kind of Kafkaesque. And that's just, I guess, kind of what my worldview is. Even when I write stuff that has no speculative or uncanny element, it still kind of comes out both kind of strange and kind of absurdist sometimes. So just kind of naturally happened. I just started writing fiction. I would give it to friends, and they would say, "Oh, that's weird," and then I just started writing novels, and I can't really remember a time when I wasn't writing. So it just, there's not much of a story to tell because it happened so organically.
Who were the writers that inspired you?
Well, I'd say there was an intermediate period when I really enjoyed the works of Angela Carter and Vladimir Nabokov and an American writer named Edward Whittemore. And then, of course, there were also science fiction writers like John Brunner, especially in books like Stand on Zanzibar. And then mainstream writers like John Irving in his huge ass kind of family chronicles. Something about, in novels especially, I like novels that have a real big scope but are also very personal in some way. And so those would be the ones. And right now, it's just tough to say because, my wife and I edit so many anthologies. We encounter so much fiction that, like for the weird anthology we did, we had to read almost 6 million words of fiction and then narrow it down to almost 1 million for the book. And when you read that much fiction, you kind of lose track of of who your favorites are. You find so much stuff. One writer I would point out, who's not very well known, but he won the Philip K. Dick Award in 1996, Stepan Chapman, has a novel called The Troika that I recommend highly. And I recommend it highly because it breaks almost every rule of writing you can think of while still being compulsively readable and not particularly experimental. And what I learned from that was how to be daring. And how to take chances. And I still think about that book most of the time when I'm writing fiction because it does so many amazing things in it.
The listeners has requested more book recommendations. Do you have any more?
Well, I mean, Angela Carter is probably one of the most important English language writers in the post-World War II period. I mean, she writes a lot of fantasy. She writes stuff that's considered feminist, but then also she's inspired by the surrealists. So literally, she's kind of like the person who took the art and fiction of writers like Leonora Carrington from back in the 20s and 30s and 40s and applied more of a plot to it, right? It's not just kind of dream surreal imagery. And so she was very inspirational for that reason because I write stuff that's very surreal at times. And the challenge when you do that is how do you find the right form or structure so that it doesn't just become a dream diary or something, that it actually has interesting characterization and structure. So she would be one of them. And Edward Whittemore is definitely very obscure. He's kind of like Thomas Pynchon if Thomas Pynchon wrote a little more simply. And he was an ex-CIA station chief in the Middle East. So his books are all set in the Middle East, and they're very complex in terms of their geopolitics. But they also are kind of magic realists. There's one that's called Jerusalem Poker. I highly recommend if you can find it. Jerusalem Poker is about a 30-year poker game for control of Jerusalem and the different quarters: the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Jewish quarter. And it's presided over by a man who may or may not be 7,000 years old. So it's just kind of, really interesting kind of go for broke kind of story. I really should list some stuff that's more current, I guess. I really like Clarice Lispector, a Brazilian writer, who's kind of again on that edge between realism and surrealism. I'm looking at my bookshelves right now just to see if there's anything else I can think of. Another one I would suggest seeking out, and I don't know if he's published in Swedish, is Michel Bernanos, The Other Side of the Mountain. Very much influenced by Lovecraft, but very, very original story, very, very creepy. And basically, if you take a look at the table of contents for the anthology we did, I recommend every single one of those writers. Contemporary writers, it's kind of difficult. We do so much research for these books that I don't necessarily keep up on individual contemporary weird writers. I tend to read a variety of different things and try to find weird fiction in places you wouldn't expect. So.
Could you talk a little bit about your own books?
Sure. Well, The Southern Reach is Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance. Before that, I wrote something called the Ambergris Cycle, which was City of Saints and Madmen, which is a collection of short stories that form a mosaic novel and is heavily illustrated in places. And it's about an imaginary city called Ambergris, which combines various attributes of both Western and Eastern cities in kind of creating it, and kind of draws on my childhood experience in the Peace Corps traveling a lot. And then the follow-up to that, Shriek and Afterward, is a kind of 60-year family chronicle that also encompasses a war going on in the city between various publishers in this imaginary city. Publishers are also merchants controlling their own lines of distribution, have their own standing armies. And so there's publishers actually going to war with one another in the city. And then in the third book, Finch, it's set 100 years after the other books. And these underground inhabitants of the city have come above ground and taken over the city. And it's kind of like a situation like Paris during World War II, or certain aspects of Baghdad during the Iraq War, where you have a failed city or a failed city state and people trying to survive. And this detective is trying to solve an impossible mystery involving two people who have been murdered. And it leads them to very strange places, including like transdimensional portals and things like that. It's not really science fiction, because science fiction is usually dealing with kind of logical solutions and is a little more straightforward. I think of it as weird fiction in the sense of exploring an unknown that is either uncanny or supernatural, or seems to be that way, has the same attributes. So the Southern Reach novels, ultimately, you could say they're science fiction, but they're actually using horror and weird fiction tropes and ideas to get there. And the thing that I find useful about that is that weird fiction really isn't about solutions. It isn't about rationality of thought. And I don't find humans to be very rational or very consistent. And so I find that it's a much better label and a better way to think of the fiction, because it kind of conveys how I see the world, and it kind of touches on like Kafka and writers like that, who I think also had this sense of human beings not being that rational, and who were kind of absurdist writers. There is kind of a dark humor running through some of the books. It really depends on which book you're talking about. I mean, the Southern Reach is about these expeditions into this strange, pristine wilderness where something is altering people and animals. But it's also about ecological devastation. It's about a dysfunctional government agency. You can kind of read it the way that you want to read it. If you like spy espionage, the second book is kind of your thing. If you like bureaucratic nightmares, then there's another viewpoint. If you like wilderness adventures, I try to leave enough room for reader imagination to kind of like have their own entry point into the stories.
Jag försökte få Jeff att prata om olika tekniker och tips på historieberättande, men han verkade inte vara så sugen. Och det kan jag i och för sig förstå. Han vill ju att folk ska köpa hans bok, och så undervisar han ju och håller kurser som han vill ha betalt för. Men jag kan ju faktiskt säga som så att om man är intresserad av att skriva, speciellt fantastisk fiction, så kan jag varmt rekommendera Wonderbook. Det är en riktig guldgruva. To this day, I still encounter people who are horrified at vivid imaginations and people who have a very dark imagination.
Fuck off. I don't know. I don't really have I don't know what to say. I mean, if you have a quote unquote overactive imagination, there's not much you can do about that except enjoy it. I've encountered within genre sometimes people saying to me, especially early on, "Oh, that's really weird," and it always struck me as odd that somebody from within the science fiction fantasy community would basically be saying that is too strange or too imaginative in a certain way, because those are the people who are supposed to be sympathetic to it. So I actually think that kind of crosses boundaries, and you find readers both in sci-fi and fantasy who are very conservative, and general readers who are. And all I would say is that there's really nothing to be done except follow your muse and use that imagination, and don't worry about haters. I know that's easy to say, but I don't really know what other advice there would be for that. If you're going to work in this line of work, you can't worry too much about what people think. That's all I can say, as much as possible. It's different if it's actually affecting how people perceive you at a job in a way that negatively impacts on how your work performance is viewed and things like that, obviously. But then that becomes an HR issue.
Ja, och med de orden så avslutar vi. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller och musiken är gjord av Testbild. Hej då.